Picture this, God himself stepping down to defend a single man. That man, Moses. Miriam and Aaron, Moses' own sister and brother, began whispering against him, questioning his authority. Why does God speak only through Moses? They asked, doubting his role. But God, who hears every whisper, called them out. In a thundering voice he asked, "Why weren't you afraid to speak against my servant Moses?" Just then, Miriam's skin turned leprous, white as snow. A punishment from God himself, a warning to all. Moses was not just a man, he was God's chosen leader, called to carry out God's will with a people constantly testing the limits of his patience. Now let's dive deeper into Moses' journey and the weight of God's judgment on those who dared disobey. We're about to see the devastating consequences of turning against God's chosen, ignoring his commands, and forgetting the fearful reverence he demands. This story is about justice, obedience, and the wrath poured out when people stray. So stay with us until the end as we journey through these dramatic tales that will leave you stunned by the power of God, the role of Moses, and the fate of those who disobeyed. Our first story begins at the foot of Mount Sinai. Imagine the scene. Moses had just gone up the mountain to meet with God. The people of Israel were left to wait. Days turned into weeks, and soon doubts crept in. They began to ask, "Where is this Moses? Is he coming back at all?" Instead of patience, they chose rebellion. Led by Aaron, they collected all the gold they had and melted it down, fashioning a golden calf to worship. They danced, shouted, and declared, "These are your gods, Israel, who brought you up out of Egypt." Exodus 32:4. At the very moment Moses was receiving the 10 Commandments from God, the people were breaking the very first commandment, "You shall have no other gods before me." Now picture Moses descending from the mountain, tablets in hand, face shining with the presence of God, only to see the sight before him. God had already warned him, saying, "Go down, for your people, whom you brought up out of Egypt, have become corrupt." Exodus 32:7. As Moses came down, anger burned within him. He saw the dancing, the idol worship, and in a fit of rage, he shattered the stone tablets. Then, in one swift action, he ground the golden calf to powder, mixed it with water, and forced the people to drink it, a bitter reminder of their rebellion. But the punishment didn't stop there. Moses stood at the entrance of the camp and called, "Whoever is on the Lord's side, come to me." The Levites gathered around him, and at Moses' command they went through the camp, striking down those who had betrayed God. Around 3,000 people died that day. Exodus 32:28. This was no minor offense. It was an outright rebellion against God, and the consequences were severe. Now, as Israel journeyed through the wilderness, the seeds of rebellion didn't stop at the golden calf. Soon after, we meet Korah, Dathan, Abiram, and 250 other leaders, respected men among the Israelites. Korah, a Levite, became jealous of Moses' authority, and he boldly confronted Moses and Aaron, saying, "You have gone too far. The whole community is holy, every one of them, and the Lord is with them. Why do you set yourselves above the Lord's assembly?" Numbers 16:3. Korah's rebellion was no small challenge. It was an attempt to overthrow Moses and Aaron, to seize power and disregard God's appointed leadership. Moses, in his humility, fell face down before God and proposed a test. "Tomorrow," he said, "the Lord will show who belongs to him." Numbers 16:5. The next day, Korah and his followers stood before the tent of meeting with their censers, offering incense. Moses then spoke, "If these men die a natural death, then the Lord has not sent me. But if the earth opens its mouth and swallows them, you will know that these men have treated the Lord with contempt." Numbers 16:29-30. Just as he finished speaking, the ground beneath Korah and his followers split open, and they were swallowed alive. along with their households and possessions. Numbers 16:31-33. In an instant, they were gone, plunged into the depths as the earth closed over them. The people of Israel fled in terror, crying, "The earth is going to swallow us too." Their rebellion against God's chosen leader had led to swift, supernatural justice. But rebellion didn't stop there. After years of wandering, the people grew tired. They complained against God and Moses, saying, "Why have you brought us up out of Egypt to die in the wilderness? There is no bread, there is no water, and we detest this miserable food." Numbers 21:5. The manna that sustained them had become a burden in their eyes, and they spoke out against God's provision. God's response was terrifying. He sent fiery serpents among them, and they bit the people, causing many to die. Numbers 21:6. With every bite, the people felt the consequence of their words, their doubt, and their ingratitude. In agony, they cried out to Moses, "We have sinned when we spoke against the Lord and against you. Pray that the Lord will take the snakes away from us." Numbers 21:7. God provided a way of healing. He instructed Moses to make a bronze serpent and lift it on a pole. "Anyone who is bitten can look at it and live," he promised. And as the people looked upon this symbol of their sin and God's mercy, they were healed. This event would echo through history, a reminder that even in wrath, God provided a way of salvation, a lesson the people would carry forward. One might think the people had learned their lesson, but soon they rose up in another wave of grumbling, this time against Moses and Aaron directly. After Korah's rebellion, the people accused them, saying, "You have killed the Lord's people." Numbers 16:41. Grumbling once again against God's chosen leaders. God's anger was kindled, and he appeared at the tent of meeting. Moses and Aaron fell on their faces, pleading for the people, but a plague had already begun to spread through the camp, and people were dying. Quickly, Moses told Aaron to take his censer, fill it with incense, and make atonement for the people. Aaron ran into the midst of the assembly, standing between the living and the dead, and the plague stopped. But by the time it ended, 14,700 people had perished because of their grumbling. Numbers 16:49. It was a stark warning that God's patience had limits, and that disobedience, even in the form of murmuring, could bring devastating consequences. Rebellion took many forms, and at Peor it was through temptation. The men of Israel fell into sin with the Moabite women, who enticed them to join in their idol worship, bowing to the gods of the Moabites. The Lord's anger burned against Israel, and he commanded Moses, "Take all the leaders of these people, kill them, and expose them in broad daylight before the Lord, so that the Lord's fierce anger may turn away from Israel." Numbers 25:4. A plague swept through the camp, and as the people wailed, Phinehas, son of Eleazar, saw an Israelite man with a Midianite woman, and in zeal for God took a spear and killed them both. With that act, the plague was halted, but not before 24,000 people had died. Numbers 25:9. The message was clear. God would not tolerate compromise or idolatry among his people. But perhaps the greatest judgment of all was the 40 years of wandering. When the people reached the borders of the Promised Land, they sent spies ahead. 10 of the 12 spies returned with fearful reports, doubting that they could conquer the land. Their doubt angered God, for he had already promised them victory. As a result, God declared that this generation would not enter the land, but would instead wander in the wilderness for 40 years. 1 year for each day the spies had explored the land. Numbers 14:34. This punishment meant that an entire generation, those 20 years and older, would die in the wilderness. Only Joshua and Caleb, the 2 spies who trusted God, would enter the land. 40 years of wandering, a daily reminder of their disobedience and lack of faith. Moses was indeed a powerful leader, an instrument of God's wrath against rebellion and disobedience. Through him, we see that while God is patient, his patience has limits. These stories are reminders that God demands reverence, obedience, and a heart that trusts in his promises. So what about us? How often do we grumble, doubt, or forget God's faithfulness? These stories should inspire us to remain faithful, to trust, and to remember the cost of rebellion. Don't forget to leave your thoughts in the comments and subscribe to Flash Bible Stories for more powerful lessons from the Word of God.